Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Henrik Wahlgren from the SA Wine Industry Association. Welcome to our webinar this morning on vintage payroll practices 2024. We're just going to let more attendees joining us. So this webinar will run for about 90 minutes, and there will also be opportunities for questions. Today's webinar will be presented by my colleagues Louise Matthews and Annalise Sadar, who I will hand over to soon. The webinar will be recorded, so that will be provided to participants post the event. If you do have questions, given that you're muted, there is a chat function, so please feel free to type in your question, and I will monitor that during the presentation, and then jump in and pose those questions to Louise and Annalise during the webinar. And also, there's always, of course, an opportunity to talk to us individually after the session. You can always send us an email or give us a call if there's anything in particular that you want to discuss. Louise, if you could just scroll down to the agenda. So what we're going to look at today is obviously a deep dive into the Wine Industry Award. So we will look at legislation and compliance, see how the award fits into the broader sort of regulatory framework. We will then look at the minimum entitlements. What are the minimum entitlements in modern awards? The main considerations of the Wine Award. So looking at things like penalty rates and overtime rates, shift work, classification, minimum wages. There will be a number of illustrations of rosters and how that will impact pay and meal breaks. Some considerations for employment during vintage. So looking at other things that you need to take into account when engaging workers, and then some key takeaways. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Louise.
Great. Thank you, Henrik. What we're going to do is get started talking about legislation and modern awards. So really just having a look at what the minimum entitlements are and what we need to do to adhere to them, and also why. Now, I understand that there'll be a number of you on the call that know some of this fundamental groundwork that I'm going to go through, but it's just a good reminder, a good refresher, and particularly I know we've got some newer people to payroll practices in our industry, so it's good to just sort of start at the base. So just a quick one about why you should be compliant. I mean, number one, it is the law, so it is a requirement to be compliant with any of the legislation we are talking about. You know, there are a couple of reasons there are fines and penalties from the Fair Work Ombudsman, for non-compliance. There's obviously the reputation to your business and to the industry, particularly when it comes to underpayments. I'm sure that you might be familiar with some of the headlines across the country with underpayments, not necessarily in our industry, but, you know, they do make a splash in the newspapers and it can affect your reputation. I think one thing I did want to note, which is really pleasing about our industry, is that we recently as SAWIA met with some delegates from the Fair Work Ombudsman to just sort of touch base about our industry. And they were here in Adelaide, and they were mentioning that they'd just done a blitz of fast food places in Adelaide looking for underpayments, asking to see their books. What they mentioned is that the wine industry is not an area of focus for them. And so that's really quite pleasing for us, is that does sort of suggest that they're not getting a huge amount of complaints. It's not an industry that they're concerned about. Now, we can't be complacent and rest on our laurels there. You know, I think that's great that, you know, we probably are not going to have a blitz in our industry, but it does mean that, you know, that won't, you know, stay forever if we have people that start to call up the ombudsman and, you know, sort of suggest that maybe our industry isn't, you know, at the standard it needs to be. But nonetheless, I think that's quite pleasing that it's not really an area of focus for them right now. There's the third piece in terms of that we should remain compliant for is around the environmental, social and governance section, the ESG. Essentially, you know, there's a lot of frameworks, or using this framework people use it to evaluate a company's performance and it's gained significant importance in the business world, as investors, stakeholders increasingly considering that kind of framework and making business decisions on whether you're meeting compliance or social obligations. And then I guess within that kind of sits that market access issue. I know we've got a number of people that export overseas, and they'll, Sainsbury's or whatever might be asking, are you meeting the minimum requirements? So again, it's just sort of a good reminder that compliance is, multifaceted approach, not just because it's the law. So in terms of what is the law and what governs the employment relations landscape and wages in the country, we have sort of a big pyramid, which kind of goes through from the top here. We have our legislation that governs very minimum conditions. So our legislation would be really sort of around that Fair Work Act, including the National Employment Standards, and that sets our base. That's the safety net. You can't go below that. If you have an enterprise agreement, then you would that would be your next set of terms and conditions, your employment conditions, followed by a modern award. When we get to an employment contract here, that's the core agreement that you'd have with your employees, and that's where other conditions and terms that are outside those legislative frameworks can come into it. So you could set out in a contract of employment about what happens about above award payments. You could do other conditions that aren't covered by the legislation, such as notice, and dictate that an employee has to give you a certain period of notice, which actually isn't covered in the National Employment Standards. We then look at the position descriptions and policies. And so while they're not necessarily sort of legislative, if you've got them, then they can provide that framework in that holistic view to make sure you've got the right terms and conditions and your employees know where to start. So on the left, we've kind of got the authority and the importance, and then the relevance over here on the right. So just a bit of a reminder about what governs the legislation for you. If we look at I mentioned the modern awards. So again, this session is predominantly on the wine industry award and the interpretation, how that affects payroll. Just want to spend a moment talking about award coverage in the wine industry. So we have a number of different awards that tend to cover multiple employees in your business, particularly I'd say most of you are here because you've got the wine industry award, and that's the one we're going to focus on today. But I did want to mention that there are a couple of others that tend to pop up from time to time, which we are not covering in detail today, but a lot of the principles will be the same. So the biggest one that we see after the wine industry typically is the restaurant award. We have a few on the manufacturing associated industries. A number will also be covered by the Clerks Award with your admin roles. And then the one that's popping up more and more recently is the Miscellaneous Award, which is predominantly used when an employee is not covered by another award and the job itself is found in other awards, and it's not professional enough or senior enough to be exempt from the Miscellaneous Award. So just as a general rule of thumb on the Miscellaneous Award, if there's no other award that applies to a relatively junior non-managerial role, it's likely to be covered by the Miscellaneous Award. Now, why am I sort of mentioning these different awards? Again, I'm sure there's a really vast number of you that know this already, but it's really important to get that award coverage right, because not getting it right can mean potential underpayments. You've got, somebody can make a claim for 6 years if you, think about how many staff, what you're paying them, and if it's wrong, then that could be a significant under or overpayment for a long period of time. So it's really essential to make sure you've got the right award. Again, we'll jump into the wine industry in a second, but luckily I think that's quite a clear contextual view of we're either in the wine industry or we're not. The one where we tend to find it can get a bit tricky is whether you're looking at it if you had a cellar door work, if you got a restaurant or a cellar door and you're trying to work out if there's any crossover there, that's where we sort of see the most amount of ambiguity. If you've got some questions on that, either we can try and make sure we've got some time at the end, or send us an email separately and we can see if we can help out if you're not sure where to go with that award coverage. So focusing in and sort of pinpointing into the wine industry award specifically, again, there's probably a lot of you that already know this, but just to remember with the wine industry or any award coverage, is the first step is to work out coverage, who is covered by your award. For us, it's pretty simple. It's employers in the wine industry and employees in the classifications within that award. What does it include? Growing and producing, processing wine grapes and wine products. And then some sample roles would be your vineyard workers, your vineyard hands, your cellar workers, cellar door salespeople, packers and bottlers, and lab attendants. So again, fortunately, we're pretty straightforward in the wine industry. There are lots of awards that have very generic and ambiguous sort of coverage clauses. But if anybody's not sure, please do reach out after the session. So once we have our award coverage, so we know we're in the wine industry award, the next step we're going to look at is the classifications and streams. Again, fortunately for us in the wine industry, pretty simple with our streams. We have a number of them. We mainly use those top ones, and the Coopers is not used as much, so that we might have a couple of people on the call that may use it from time to time. If anybody has concerns about getting somebody in the right stream, again, reach out. But fortunately for us, they're pretty straightforward. So the key thing now, we've got our award coverage. We're in the wine industry. We've got our stream, and then we're going to start to look at our classifications. So if the reason why this is really important is that if employee's employment is by the award, their rate of pay is going to be determined by the classification that they fall in. And the classifications are, descriptions of roles and work types, usually with reference to duties performed, number of direct reports, experience and qualifications. So for us here in the wine industry, we've got a number of grades, a number of class levels, if you will, within that classification structure. And I guess this is where the challenge comes in, because classifications are sort of notoriously challenging to properly assess. We've got an award that uses pretty general language. The stream is really easy, but sometimes the duties can be either a bit generic, or the award hasn't really kept up with some of the evolving technology and the way that jobs move, as we modernise. So it can be a bit problematic. So at a practical level, we're going to look at each classification and work out which employee fits into which section. So within our classifications in the wine industry award, we've kind of got some key milestones that you meet that make it a little bit simpler. So our grade 1 and 2 are time-based. You're either, it's 12 months, then you move after that to 24 months, and then after that you're a grade 3. So grade 3, you could stay there forever theoretically. It's not time-based. Then we get to grade 4 and 5, and it's really based on experience. So grade 4, considerable experience, and grade 5 starts to move into that supervisor, low-level management. So that is quite consistent across all the streams. Just keep in mind that cellar door, for whatever reason, doesn't have a level 5, but all of the other streams do have a level 5. Just before we move on, I'll just mention that, again, don't want to keep banging on about contraventions and keeping compliant, but there can be significant penalties for contravening the Act. So the key part really is making sure you have a framework to ensure that you've got a process to classify your employees. Are you recording that information? I will move to the next slide here. If the employee was to make a complaint, because as I said, sometimes the classifications can quite get a bit generic, what's your framework that you could give to the ombudsman if they came knocking and, somebody made a complaint? Do you record all their experience? Do you have it in a system? Is it in your own payroll system? Do you have it on paper? But it's a good idea to kind of make sure you got a little bit of a framework available and adequate records, should you need it. Just moving on to a quick example of classifications. The Hours Vineyard is looking to employ Brianne as a vineyard hand in a casual capacity. Over the last 3 years, she's built up some experience doing vintages for local businesses, about 12 months experience altogether, and the hours don't know whether to employ her as a grade 1 or 2. She's not particularly skilled in the vineyard, and she would be doing the most basic forms of work under direct supervision. So in this instance, what we would look at is, as I mentioned before, the wine award says you cannot be a grade 1 for more than 12 months. So not including the time between the vintages, she's worked for 12 months cumulatively in local wine businesses. Therefore, she must be a grade 2. Now, one of the big questions we often get is what about overseas experience? Does that count? And again, what I would say is the rule of thumb here would be is that, yes, it does. Our view is that all experience counts towards that 12 months. Now, I'm sure there's exceptions to the rules in some circumstances. What happens if they had 10 years between? What happens if the technology's moved on so much that whatever experience they did have isn't relevant anymore? So there could be instances where you could be able to argue that they didn't have the 12 months. But again, back to the earlier slide is what's your framework for deciding that? Do you have evidence? Do you have a good reason? Ultimately, it would be yourself or, whoever that made the decision sitting in front of the inspector trying, explaining why and, what would they say if you were giving them your reason? So ultimately, our view is that they got 12 months. They're a level 2, albeit I'm sure there's some exceptions every now and again.
Louise, we just had a question on classifications.
Yes.
And the question is there a minimum classification for an employee that has completed a traineeship in viticulture and has a Cert 3? Whether you want to answer that or what do you want me to?
Yeah, go for it, Henrik.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So I guess the answer is, in short, our classifications aren't necessarily qualification driven. So we don't have that. If you have a certificate that you necessarily are jumping up to, or I shouldn't say necessarily, there's nothing in the award which says that if you have a certificate, you have to be on this level. So it's really about the skills. It's about the skills that the person has and the experience that they have and what you require them to do. So I would suspect that if they have undertaken the certificate, they probably have some prior experience in the industry. So you might be looking at 2, you might be looking at 3. And if they have responsibilities, Louise, in terms of supervision and so on, that would also put them up sort of in a different classification. Is there anything you'd like to add, Louise?
No, I think that's a great point, Henrik. And I think that comes back to what, if you have a sort of a bit of a framework that says if you've got A, B, and C, you might be a 2 and you might be a 2, or this, it's a 3. That can really go to helping, classify those employees.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Henrik, and thank you for the question. So what I'm just going to move on to is the minimum wages. So now that we've got our classification, we can look at our wages. Again, the award sets out what our wage rate's going to be depending on your classification. The rates are available, from the Fair Work Ombudsman, or we provide wage sheets if you're a member of us. The only thing I just really wanted to note at the moment is that we are in the midst of a little bit of a change. There's a new change from January, the first pay period after 1 January, is that there will be now a progression point for grade 1. So they'll start at this rate here, and then after 6 months, they will progress to a midway pay point that will be above this figure, which we can provide as well. So if you've got your vintage casuals and they're there less than 6 months and they're on grade 1, it won't really impact you. But if you're thinking about keeping them on, just to note, there'll be a small bump after that 6-month period. All right, so now just getting a little bit further into the award and the employment categories. Again, I know there's probably a huge number of you that know some of this already, but our key employment categories in our award are full-time, part-time, and casual employees. So our full-time workers are engaged to work 38 hours a week, our part-time is less than 38, and then our casuals, there's no guaranteed hours and essentially employed when they're needed. The key part I do want to just mention about these employment categories that are maybe slightly different to other awards is that our part-timers, they must have a set pattern of work, but it's quite flexible the way the award is written. So there's a little bit more flexibility. It doesn't have to have start and finish times. It just has to have an agreed set pattern of work. And then our casuals, the other piece to notice is we've got a 4-hour minimum engagement. We do have an exception for weather events in certain situations when the weather event was not expected, and it is pruning or harvesting work was about to occur, and then that period can drop to a minimum of 2 hours. The other keynote I'll just mention is that our new casual conversion process has been in with the closing loopholes changes. So the onus has now moved to an employee to say, hey, I think I'm a permanent, I'd like to be a permanent employee, rather than the employer needing to provide an option to move to permanent if the pattern had fits it. So if you're looking at your vintage casuals and they're going to be there less than 6 months, probably not any concerns. But just a couple of notes is that, making sure that if you are offering casual employment in a letter of offer, you might just confirm that it's for the vintage period. So you're already just setting that up that they're casual in nature. All right, now we're going to look at we're going to hand over to Annalise, and she's going to take us through a little bit more detail some of the really key points of the wine industry award.
Can I stop you there? We just have another question.
Yes, please.
Yes, we just have another question. And the question was, we have casuals who just turned 18 who work in kitchen at cellar door casually, but I've worked with the business for over 12 months. We have them on the cellar door 1 now. Is that correct? They are still casual. Do you want me to have a go, or do you want to reply, Louise?
Yeah, no, sorry, Henrik, I didn't catch all of it. So if
Okay, all right. Yeah, I'll jump in. So basically, casuals, they have worked in the kitchen at the cellar door, and they've been with the business for over 12 months. We have them at cellar door grade 1 now. Is that correct? So there's actually a couple of different aspects to that, because if they work in the kitchen, in other words, they're doing food preparation and so on, that is strictly not covered by the wine award. We don't have kitchen hands, for example. So the wine award really only covers, in terms of cellar door, the tastings, and if there's some ancillary, I guess, food preparation, but you're primarily working in cellar door sales and doing tastings, and you do some ancillary platters. Our advice is that that's still covered by wine. But if you have someone who's working, pardon me, who's working in a really much in a sort of in a kitchen capacity, then strictly that's not covered by wine. So you may well be in a situation where you got 2 awards applying. One when they work in the kitchen doing traditional kitchen work, and one when they're working in the cellar door. And it's also another option, and that is that they could also be covered by a 3rd award, which is the miscellaneous award, depending on what they do. So I guess the advice I would have in terms of grade 1 in the cellar door, it is limited to 12 months. So if they worked in doing wine tastings and cellar door sales for more than 12 months, they have to be moved up to grade 2. But in this instance, they may have had 12 months within the business, but possibly actually doing less than 12 months in cellar door duties. So it doesn't necessarily mean that all of that will be taken into account, because it depends on if they worked, say, for 8 months in the kitchen and 4 months in the cellar door. They haven't really had 12 months on the wine award, so to speak. So long story short, it might be worth if you reach out to us, and we can assist you, and we can look at this sort of and just work out where they fit, because it can be a bit complex.
All right, thank you, Henrik. All right, so moving on, just to, like Louise said, just going through a few key points just in the wine industry award itself. So I thought we'd just go through an overview of ordinary hours. So essentially, ordinary hours is made up of 2 key factors. So it's the total hours worked in a week or day. So total ordinary hours can be worked in a week for a day worker or shift worker of an average of up to 38 hours per week. So the word average points to the ability to implement an averaging arrangement. So for example, you could have an agreement which allows an employee to average out their hours to work 72 hours in a fortnight. So that means they could work more than 38 hours in one week and less in the other to make up that 72 ordinary hours. The other key with this is that ordinary hours must also not exceed 10 hours on any day. except where there is agreement between you as a business and the majority of your employees, where you can have an agreement to extend the maximum hours up to 12 hours. But yeah, typically it's just up to 10 hours is the maximum hours for the day. The other key point is that there's also ordinary hours applies to the days of the week and times of the day that you can work your ordinary hours. That could be, the span between, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. and then on the specific days that you can work your ordinary hours. Other relevant influences that we'll talk about will be penalty rates. So these are still ordinary hours, but they attract a higher rate, usually for working like abnormal hours, like shift work, or for working particular days, like working on a Sunday or public holiday will attract penalty rates. And yeah, the other one is also shift penalties. So that's applied when they're working shift work, so afternoon shift or night shift. And the other one we'll delve deeper into is overtime. So basically any hours that aren't ordinary hours are overtime rates. Just moving on. We've put together a little table summarising ordinary hours in the Wine Award. We're going to focus on day workers for now. So there's a few different special conditions depending on the classification stream and time of the year. So firstly, there are extended ordinary hours during vintage to acknowledge the extra operational requirements, and this only applies to the vineyard stream. So if we look here, there's a stream that applies just during vintage for vineyard workers. So in the award, vintage is defined as a period not exceeding 6 months between November and June inclusive, which starts on the day when the harvest of grape begins at a particular vineyard and ends on the last day the wine grapes are harvested at that vineyard. So essentially during the vintage period for your business, your workers can work slightly earlier than normal. So that's from 5 a.m. to 6 p.m. And they can also work Saturday with that still being ordinary hours. Whereas if you look at these two middle streams, this is sort of where the majority of the classifications fall under, and this would be considered sort of the normal span of hours. So it's a little bit later from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. So that's your bottling line, your lab workers, cellar workers, warehouse and whatnot. And you'll also note that it also applies to vineyard workers, but during non-vintage period, it goes back to this sort of standard set of hours. Now, what's important to note is you'll see at the top, cellar door sales comes in sort of its special category of its own. So again, not to be confused with cellar hand. When I first started, I quite got confused between cellar hand and cellar door sales. But so this is for workers in the cellar door. They actually have a wider span of days that they can work on as ordinary hours. This is because obviously in cellar door, you typically would be working on the weekends. That's when you're busiest. So that means that on these Sunday and Saturdays, they can actually work these days as ordinary hours and not over. It doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be overtime rates. And these conditions apply all year round. And so, yeah, that's just to note then when your workers are performing ordinary hours on these 2 days or during vintage on a Saturday, they will still have penalty rates on that day. So, for example, for working Saturday, it's 125% loading and 200% on Sundays. So it's not overtime. And it is ordinary hours, but you do have penalties that apply to working weekend work. So yeah, moving on. If anyone has any questions on that one. Is that a question?
Yes, I've got a question here from Sophie. Can we modify the spread of ordinary hours for cellar door staff via a change to their contract? Example, cellar door open from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m.
Yes. Let me just read that again.
So I'll just read it out for everybody. Can we modify the spread of ordinary hours for cellar door staff via a change to their contract?
Yeah, I mean, given that it's 8 p.m, being that that's outside the spread of hours, potentially you're looking into shift work. Maybe Henrik, did you want to grab that one?
Sorry, it helps if I am mute. So yes, so in the award in clause 13.6c, it addresses that, and it says that the spread of hours may be varied by agreement between the employer and the majority of the employees in the relevant workplace or section. So, Sophie, what you would need to do then is that you would need to have a discussion with your cellar door staff and reach an agreement to trade longer than 6 p.m. in ordinary hours. But alternatively, I mean, it could be addressed on an individual agreement through, it's called an individual flexibility agreement. I would say there would be a limit to how far you could go. So I say 2 hours would probably be the absolute maximum. So ordinarily would be maybe 1 hour on each side. So rather than say starting at 6 a.m. as you're entitled to do in ordinary hours, you could start at 5, for example, rather than finishing at 6 in ordinary hours, you could finish at 7. So I think 8 would be as far as I would push it, because otherwise there would be, might be questions around are really employees sort of going into overtime, and what's the benefit of them doing this in ordinary hours and so on. So majority you could do. Whilst I am speaking, we also had a different question, which is not necessarily goes to the penalty rates, but it goes to base rates of pay. And the question was, in terms of juniors, do juniors increase by age and levels? So we do have junior rates of pay in the award. So for someone who is under the age of 17, you get 80% of the adult rate. And when you are 17, you get 90%. And once you reach 18, it's a full adult rate. So you firstly have to look at the classification. Where do they fit? Are they level 1 or level 2? And then you work out their age and then apply the percentage. And you also have junior rates of pay set out in the award too. Thank you. Is there anything else that I hand over to you again? Sorry.
One more, or that's that?
We've got one more question. Why don't we answer it while we're going? So I'll just read this one out, Henrik. My understanding was that you can pay more than the award, but employees can't be worse off. So wouldn't extend ordinary hours to 8 p.m, be disadvantaging the employees, so you couldn't do it.
Yeah, so that is correct, that you can always pay more and you can't obviously pay less. The point of 13.6 is to actually is to allow 13.6c, as I said, is to allow the spread of hours to be changed. So it means that we're actually extending ordinary hours, and it doesn't say that will trigger sort of an overtime event or penalty rate event. If that was the intent, that clause wouldn't really have any work to do. So what I would say is that it can be used, but the scope is fairly limited. So you wouldn't be able to say, well, let's just treat the whole Sunday as ordinary hours. It then talks about the spread too. So the spread is really the span of hours that we have to work with. And that's why I'm saying that an hour on each side, I think you could do and just treat it as ordinary hours. But if you want to go beyond that, I think that would be to push it. Because you are basically then having people working hours that ordinarily would be overtime hours with no compensation. So I would say this is one of the very few examples where you're changing the award and there's no really there's no compensation being provided. Is that something, Louise, Annalise, do you?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think the other thing to consider with the 13.c is that it's got to be by agreement, so you can't unilaterally change it. So if your employees didn't agree to, maybe it suits them better to work later and start later, and they're quite happy. So, as Henrik said, you can do it, but there are some limitations to doing it. Great.
Yeah, I think that covers it. Thank you. Just moving on. Yep, like we said, the weekend work does attract a penalty rate. And as you can see, then by default, anyone that's classified in these streams, if they're working on the weekend, that'll automatically be overtime because they can't perform ordinary hours on the weekend. Right, moving on. So just lastly on ordinary hours, we're just going to cover, the award does set out different methods of arranging the 38-hour work week. It specifically lists sort of 3 options, but really it then allows the flexibility for coming up with your own arrangement by agreement with the majority of employees in a workplace or section of a workplace. So, for example, you could arrange the 38-hour work week by performing it over 19 days with 8 hours in each 4-week period with a rostered day off. I'd say typically in our award, most businesses tend to do either 5 days at 7.6 hours, so your 38 hours over the 5 days evenly, or 4 days of 8 hours and 1 day of 6 on a Friday. That's probably what we see to be typical. All right, now we've covered the ordinary hours when it comes to day workers, but I just thought we'd go through and to talk about shift work, particularly given ahead of vintage. Definitely workers would pick up a lot more shift work. Now, look, shift work is unique in that it involves work that falls outside the span of ordinary hours, but it can still be performed as ordinary hours with a shift penalty attached to it. So what do we consider shift work? We've got 3 types of shifts. We've got an afternoon shift, which is a shift that finishes after 6 p.m. and at or before midnight. We've got night shift, which finishes after midnight and at or before 8 a.m. And then we've got permanent night shift, which applies the same rules to night shift, but a permanent night shift worker is someone who either only works night shift, or they remain on night shift longer than 4 consecutive weeks, or they work on a night shift which does not rotate with other shifts or day work, such that they get at least 1/3 of their working time off night shift in each shift cycle. Bit confusing, but if you want to clarify that, we can clarify that with you. So yeah, essentially you're looking at when the shift ends, like when you're rostering it, it's what time the shift ends. So it's about not so much about when it starts, but you know, it'll be an afternoon shift if it finishes after 6 p.m. or before midnight. So when is a shift a shift? Now, the good thing about shift work, it's got the benefit of, you know, great flexibility for rostering ordinary hours outside the normal span for day work, which is especially helpful during vintage, which enables, you know, 24/7 coverage. But the key is it can't be an afterthought. It must be planned ahead. So we recommend you need to advise your workers if they're going to work a combination of day work and shift work. So that could be when you're, you know, hiring them as a vintage casual, having it in their contract, making them aware that they might be doing a mix of day work and shift work. You also, if you require them to perform shift work, it need to be planned ahead. So they should be rostered to perform that shift work. They also need to be paid for a half an hour break as a shift worker, which I will explain breaks a little bit more later. But for example, if a worker is rostered to perform day work and they finish it, and they're rostered to finish at 5, but they end up having to stay back, they have to work a bit of overtime, and their shift ends up finishing at 6:30 p.m. It doesn't suddenly convert their shift to shift work just because their shift finished after 6 p.m. It's kind of what was the intention when you rostered them on, if they were intended to be rostered on as a shift worker. So we've also done a little summary table to hopefully make it a little bit clearer around shift work. So as I've said, we'll see here with afternoon work, it's any shift finishing after 6 p.m. and at or before midnight, and night work after shift that is finishing after 12 a.m. and finishing before or at 12 a.m. Again, so they're exactly the same, but obviously a permanent night shift worker will have a higher penalty rate, which I'll go into. So the key in determining shift type is what time the shift is rostered to end. You'll notice that shift work has greater flexibility. So as opposed to the other table, these ordinary hours can be performed any day of the week, whereas before, you know, weekend work wasn't able to be worked in some streams as ordinary hours. You'll also notice that you can perform ordinary hours on the weekend, but it does attract a shift penalty for working on a penalty rate for working on a weekend. So I'll just, as a note, overtime still does apply in respect of working hours beyond 10 hours in a day or 38 hours in a week, but it does actually also apply to working outside the span of shift work hours. So to be a shift, it needs to fall within these categories. But for example, if you rostered an employee to work night shift from say 3 a.m. to 8 a.m., if the shift ran over, so even though they've only worked 5 hours, if the shift ran over, they worked overtime beyond 8 a.m., any hours worked beyond 8 a.m. should be overtime because they were rostered as a shift worker, not a day worker. So it is then falls outside the span of shift work. All right, moving on. As I alluded to, that the working shift work, you're having to work at night, in the afternoon, and odd hours, you do get a bit of a penalty for that, which is a bit of an added benefit. So these shift penalties are applied to the minimum hourly rate, and if you have a casual, you have to add the casual loading. So afternoon shift workers, it's 115% of the minimum rate. Same for night shift. It's just permanent night shift when you're constantly working night shift that you get a bit of a higher rate, which is 130%. Now, a key is that the shift loadings don't apply on top of each other. So you don't apply an afternoon shift loading on a public holiday. You just apply the public holiday loading. So you'll note also with like afternoon, night shift, permanent night shift, all those workers are going to be receiving the same rate on the weekend. So that, there's a difference between the two there in weekdays, but because the loadings don't stack on the weekend, they technically will all be receiving the same. Just as a side note to be mindful of with shift work, just make sure that you're applying the correct penalties when you're rostering the shifts. Obviously with, say the shift is rostered for Friday to Saturday morning, then obviously once it hits the Saturday morning, there's a penalty rate that applies, and the same if you're going from Sunday to Monday, there's a difference in days with the penalties, so just be aware of that. And I guess maybe just a tip in terms of your rostering, when you look at, so if you look at work on a Saturday, say a casual worker performing shift work on a Saturday, you have to add the 25% loading. So that's 175% of the minimum rate for working shift work for working on a Saturday. Whereas a casual working overtime on a Saturday, it's only 150% of the minimum rate, and it doesn't include their casual loading. So potentially, if you only need them on for a couple hours, you'd have to do the maths, but if you only roster them on for a couple hours, it might actually be more cost effective to hire a casual to work overtime on the Saturday than paying 175% for a shift worker. But the key would be, obviously, it's only 150% for the first 2 hours, and after that it's 200%. So it just depends on the length of shift, but it might be something to look out for. You can do the maths and see what ends up being cheaper in the long run. So yeah, when it comes to shift work, there's obviously great benefits to it. Rather than having your workers have to pay them overtime rates for working outside the span of hours, they can be rostered on for a shift, which means it's a lower penalty rate. 115% is a lot lower than the overtime rates. And like I said before, it's a greater span of hours, so every day can be ordinary hours. And yeah, like obviously it's particularly useful during vintage. I guess in terms of a cost, their meal break is paid, whereas day workers, it's a half an hour unpaid meal break. So that's just something to note there. And again, we recommend sort of doing the math, planning ahead, and see what makes more sense in terms of your rostering. So if the majority of the shift is performed within day hours, but you're finishing, like for example, an 11 a.m. shift to 6:30 p.m. If you roster them on for that shift, it's afternoon work, but the majority of those hours was day work. So you're paying that afternoon shift loading where it might have made sense just to pay normal day work and then a little bit of overtime. So again, you just got to look out for making sure that you've done the maths and sort of plan this ahead of time. All right, now we'll just head into breaks, which is, I guess, quite a popular topic, which can have some issues that pop up here and there, but we'll work through it and try to get through this. So we've got day workers. So day workers can't work more than 5 hours without an unpaid meal break of between 30 and 60 minutes. And as I said, for a shift worker, they can't work more than 4.5 hours. So note that it's a little bit sooner without a paid meal break of 30 minutes. But we can have an agreement to shift that up to 6 hours in certain circumstances. There's also something called an overtime meal break. So when you require a worker to work more than 2 hours of overtime after they finish their ordinary hours, immediately after, you have to provide them with a 30-minute paid break. So basically prior to the commencement of this overtime, and then for every 4 hours of overtime thereafter, which, look, we appreciate, practically speaking, at the end of a shift, if they're required to work overtime, you might not know whether they're going to work more than 2 hours of overtime. And so it's not very practical to try and provide a break before they commence their overtime. And also, I appreciate that a lot of employees just want to get the work done and they don't want to stop and have a half an hour break. And, you know, would rather work through it and then finish a bit early if they need to. So I appreciate this is what the award says, but practically speaking, it can be quite difficult. So I guess it's a bit of a business decision in terms of how you approach this. There is a working through meal break penalty. So basically, you have to pay 150% loading on the rate that applied to the employee before the break was due until they get that break. So potentially you'd either just pay the meal break penalty, or as Henrik mentioned before, there is something called an individual flexibility arrangement. There could be the potential per individual agreement with your employee to discuss them working through that meal break. But again, the caveat is the agreement has to result in the employee being better off. So it would be, you couldn't put pressure on the employee to do this. It'd be, should ideally be at their request. And there'd need to be a justification as to why they're better off. And I mean, plenty of employees would rather just take the time, finish early and not have to take that break. But yeah, if you have any questions on that, we can sort of help work you through that. Yeah, I think Louise will go in a bit more detail in terms of the meal break penalty. Lastly, just in the award, there is a paid tea break of 10 minutes each required to be provided each day or shift as well.
We've got a couple of questions. Sorry, Henrik, I might be actually
sure.
Jumping in.
Yes. So one question was in relation to the shifts, which I think, Annalise, if you could just maybe just clarify that a bit more. So the question was, when do you change from a night shift to a permanent night shift? E.g., if there is a good chance they will stay them as vintage. As night shift all over vintage, do we pay them as permanent night shift from the beginning, or only after the 4 weeks of night shift? So when does it kick in?
I mean, if you know that they're pretty much consistently only for the most part going to be working night shift, then from the beginning I would pay them as a night shift worker. But then if you start off and you're not sure and then they become more regular in their night shifts, then it could potentially shift later on. But if you know you're intending that they are a night shift worker, then I would be paying them that night shift rate. Do you have anything to add, Henrik?
Thank you, Annalise. The second question, which I think is also very interesting, is that one of the participants said that they've invested heavily in systems and processes to allow them to administer the award. But even with those systems, they find it challenging to comply with the award at all times, because there is such a great degree of complexity and gray areas and so on. So it's hard to automate. The question was, is this something that could be addressed? In other words, is there capacity or is it feasible to simplify the award so that a small business can comply without employing someone with a law PhD? And I think that's a really good answer. probably what I can say, and it may not come as much comfort, is that in comparison to other awards, the wine industry award is actually relatively flexible and relatively sort of easy for industrial relations nerds like myself, Annalise, and Louise. There are lots of awards which are far worse. I do appreciate that. Yes, there is a sort of number of grey areas. There is still complexity. In order to simplify the award, then there has to be sort of the employer community getting together and agreeing on what we want to pursue, being willing to then lodge a case in the Fair Work Commission, investing fairly substantial resources in getting evidence from the industry. So having people who are willing to put up their hand and being witness to demonstrate why the award is not operating effectively, why it causes complexity, but also being then able to counter arguments that what we're seeking to do is to reduce entitlements of employees. Because the Fair Work Act is very strong on that the purpose of the award system is not, unfortunately, it's not to help businesses, it is to help employees. It talks about the safety net, and there's been more amendments, more changes to the Fair Work Act to further sort of boost employee entitlements, to say that this is really about providing a safety net. It's about addressing gender inequality, provide employment and so on. The cost of to employees, that is one aspect, but overall that rate's fairly low. So there is some capacity, but industry would have to really engage and get on board. A couple of years ago, SAWIA made applications to vary the wine industry award. We were looking at reducing, for example, Sunday penalties because that was comparatively high if you look at, say, other awards. And unfortunately, we didn't get enough support from industry on that. There was a number of businesses who said, well, they would love to pay a lesser penalty. But when it came to the requirement to provide evidence, being able to actually take the witness stand and do that, that's uncomfortable. And there were, we didn't have enough evidence to really say that, to back up our case. So we couldn't progress that. We were able to make some changes to the award, and this is very, very minor. So we were able to get a reduction in the casual minimum engagement for vineyard workers from 4 hours to 2 hours in limited circumstances. And that was because we did have evidence from businesses to demonstrate that was an issue. So I guess the take-home message is that, yes, we do agree it is complex. We do agree it should be simplified, but it's also a highly politicized area where we have a union movement who, of course, take a strong interest in this. And we also have currently a government which does not have much appetite at all in reducing any employee entitlements. Louise, do you want to add to that?
No, Henrik, I think you've really covered it. I think, I don't have anything to add in terms of what can we do to unwind it. I think there are challenges. The only thing I would note as well is we are the only country in the world that has these modern awards. So it is really interesting that we've gone down a path that is, significantly different to other countries, but it's a challenge at the moment to really make a difference in unwinding them in the current environment.
We've got two more questions to get to. The other question was, can you clarify if the award you're referring to is the SA State Award or the Federal Fair Work Award? So in SA, we don't have state awards that applies to private sector. This is from a business in Western Australia. And Western Australia does still have a state system, but we don't have that in SA. So I'm referring to the Wine Industry Award 2020, which apply across the country, regardless where you're located. So other states, we don't have private sector state awards, but in WA, I understand that is still the case. And finally, there was a question on if a shift spills over to a public holiday, what portion of the shift is paid at public holiday rate?
Good question.
I'll
have to bring it up.
I have to bring up the award, but I think it's for whatever. It's the other awards will split it and say that if the majority of your shift is on the public holiday, the whole shift. In this one, maybe we'll get.
I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah.
So as Louise says, in other awards, there is sort of a majority clause at times, depending on where the hours fall. We don't have a majority clause in this award. So it would be from the time the public holiday applies. So if you start working on Friday and you do, hours late at night in Friday, it spills over into a Saturday, and the Saturday is a public holiday, then the public holiday rates apply then from 12 onwards. So we don't have sort of a majority provision in terms of that.
Yeah, and like as I was saying before, like for Sunday, you might be paying the Sunday rate for the evening shift, and then as soon as it hits midnight Monday morning, you don't have to pay the Sunday rate anymore. It can be the Monday rate, which is good. All right, moving on if that's all right. Just continuing on with meal breaks. Look, we've just seen a few questions come up on this topic, and in particular, we did an audit recently, and this came up as well. So we just thought it'd be good to clarify a few points here because it does have a significant impact on your payroll calculations. So firstly, you do not need to count the paid meal break for shift workers towards ordinary hours. So just because it's paid doesn't mean it has to count towards hours worked. If you do pay that, that's fine. You're welcome to pay more, but essentially it does result in the employee reaching overtime sooner, especially if each day you're counting that half an hour shift, then it does end up, them reaching overtime sooner. And another key point is with the paid overtime meal break, that also doesn't count towards ordinary hours. Now, our reasoning is that we consider the word ordinary hours in the award does not intend to include meal breaks, and only hours actually worked go towards the shift workers' ordinary hours. But however, we do know we've got advice that when it comes to the sort of the 10-minute paid rest break, because it's quite minor, it's not considered a meal break, and that does count towards ordinary hours. That should be, included as well. And another one that's popped up a few times is we do want to clarify that the meal break is only meant to the meal break is only meant to be provided once. So when it says, a worker must not be required to work for more than 5 hours without having a meal break, it's not every 5 hours. So it's not like 5 hours they have to have a break, and then 10 hours they have to have another meal break. It's only meant to be provided once, which is also why we have that overtime meal break provision. So if they end up working longer hours, that's where that provision kicks in and you have to provide an overtime meal break. But yeah, we just wanted to clarify that for shift workers and day workers, you only need to provide that meal break once. I think
no, Alice, we do have a question about it, and I know I'm going to cover it.
Yep.
I'll just read the question out. Is what happens if the worker starts at 6 a.m. and doesn't want to take their meal break until 12 noon? So I'm just going to pop a pin in that because I do have a bit of a case study coming up that will directly answer that one.
Yeah, perfect. If we don't have any more questions immediately at this point, I might hand over to Louise then to go through overtime.
Great. Sorry, let's come back to the screen. So overtime in the award, overtime, sorry, I'm on the right screen. It applies when work isn't completed in ordinary hours, which is, we sort of spoke to it before, it's hours that aren't worked within that span of hours. Either maybe you've worked too many hours in the day, so you're over either 7.6, 8 or 10 or whatever your averaging arrangements are, or there's too many hours in the week, so it's over that 38. That's when overtime it applies. So the watch out, a couple of things is that sometimes if you've got a casual and they work 8 hours a day but they don't reach that 38 hours a week, you might be starting to pay overtime over that 8 hours, whereas if you had them on a 10-hour roster, then they wouldn't reach that amount as quickly. Other thing to note with overtime is that you can have different sections that have, you could have your vineyards work 8-hour days and cellar door work 10-hour days, all within ordinary hours. So it's worth looking at what you're currently doing and just working out whether you've got the right mechanism for your business in place. So just a really quick one, maybe not a quick one, it's a big chart. Just put a bit of a summary table of the how overtime is calculated and when it applies to the different roles. So up here we've got the casuals and shift work, we've got the permanent employees and shift work, and down here we've got the casual employees and day work and the part-time, full-time employees and day work down here.
key things to note really, Annalise has kind of been through some of the penalty rates. The casuals is probably the trickier one, where sometimes the casual loading is included in the full rate and sometimes it is not. So really on a Saturday, a Monday to Saturday, casual loading doesn't apply to overtime rates, but it does apply on the Sunday. So again, like, unfortunately for us, we've got to do a lot of maths, get a PhD in working out what's the best roster to do if you're looking at cost, or if you're just interested in how it works and what rates. That this chart is quite a handy one to work out what percentage of the penalty applies and whether the casual loading applies as well. So that's kind of the key provisions. What I wanted to do now was just kind of take you through a bit of a practical example of how this all comes together. So we're going to take a look at a vineyard worker today. This is my example. It's a vineyard worker working during vintage. They are a non-shift worker, so we haven't got shift penalties in this one. They're a permanent employee. Because it's vintage, you're rostering them 12 hours a day for 5 days a week, and the pay cycle starts on a Monday. So if that's kind of the provisions, let's have a look at what Monday might look like for this worker. So in this example, the work is starting at 4:30 a.m. So we're going to get a penalty already because they're working outside that ordinary span of 5 a.m. during vintage to 6 p.m. So we've got half an hour of OT because we're outside the ordinary hours. The employee must take a break, no more than 5 hours of working, and it's unpaid and doesn't count towards ordinary hours. I'm going to come back to the question in a minute about what if they don't want to take a break then. The worker continues working, continuing on ordinary hours. Then they hit their 8 hours for the day. They're starting to get into overtime. So the employee reaches in this example, they're doing their days at 8 hours for 4 days a week and 6 hours on the Friday. So they're required to work overtime, so they must take a paid meal break, and it's prior to commencing their overtime. So it's paid at the rate of pay. It's paid at the ordinary rate of pay. So that's in here, and it's counted towards non-ordinary hours, even though it's a paid meal break. So they then finish their break, they recommence, and they're going to recommence at the first 2 hours. They recommence at the overtime rate of the first 2 hours. So because we've already had half an hour of overtime in this day, they can work an hour and a half here. Then they hit the 2 hours, and they're starting a new penalty of 200% because now it's all time worked after that 2 hours hits that new penalty. So we can see within this day, we've got a number of different factors going on that we've got to consider. So we've got a total of 8 ordinary hours, a total of 4 overtime hours, 1 full non-ordinary hours, so a total shift of 13 hours, but it's 12 working hours. If we just look at this and then how that would look across a week, you can see that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, all pretty similar, and Friday is starting where it changes. So we start the Friday in the morning, we're still starting at 4:30 for whatever reason. They get that penalty rate here. We go to our unpaid meal break at 9:30, similar to every other day. Then we hit our 38 ordinary hours at this point. And so when we hit 38 hours, we are then moving into overtime, and we know that we need to give a paid break, no more than 2 hours. The employee has to get the paid break to work more than 2 hours of overtime immediately after finishing. So they get that paid meal break at the rate that was paid prior. And then they would work their first 2 hours. Their overtime would kick in for the first 2 hours. That would be an hour and a half here, added up with this first half hour, and then we suddenly get into 2 hours. We start to get into the overtime rate after 2 hours. Then we have another penalty that's triggered. The penalty is triggered because we're also working now 4 hours of overtime in total. We need to give another paid meal break. So the question I'm going to answer, and I think is going to answer the other question, is what happens if you don't want an employee? If the employee doesn't want to take this paid meal break, they've just had one, they've only worked a short amount of time, what do you do with this paid meal break? So there's a couple of pieces that come into play here. 2 real options are you could do individual flexibility arrangement with a employee that said that you agree that they didn't take their break. You can do that. Gets administrationally burdensome. I think you've got to do it at each time. Is it each pay cycle? Each pay cycle, you'd have to do an IFA.
Oh, no, sorry.
No, sorry. That was the other one. Sorry, but you still have to do your IFA, so you've got to agree with them, and it's got to be individual with each individual. You can't do it across the workforce. The second option is that you could pay them to work through that meal break. So if they work through that meal break, they would then receive, working through the meal break triggers 150% of the rate of pay applying immediately before the meal break. So in this case, we've got a permanent employee, so they would get 150% for this blue box. They already, so you've got to get 150% of the meal of the rate prior, immediately before the break was given, and then until a meal break is given. So in this scenario, we've got the blue box, you'd pay 150%. You would already be paying 150% in this section. And then theoretically, we've now got two penalties applying, the 150% for triggering working through a meal break and the overtime. So when two penalties apply at the same time, the Ombudsman has given clarification that the higher penalty would apply. So for this individual who was a permanent employee and working through a meal break, really the only change is that you would be providing them with 150% of the paid meal break, whereas if they took it, it would be at 100% rate because it was the rate prior to them taking a break. If you had a casual, that's where it would differ slightly because of the casual loading, the rate would start to add up a little bit more. So in this example, if you were a casual and you were working through this meal break, the penalty would apply on the casual rate. So the ordinary hours times the 25%, then times 150%, so 175 in total. So you would be higher for these two brackets here, the blue and the peach, let's call it, at 175%. Then the 200% would kick in, which is higher anyway, so you'd pay that. So this is where you do need to work out like obviously operations is probably the key thing that you're looking at when, if they're working through a meal break, is it operationally warranted? You want the right people at the right time. But if this is a case where you might choose a permanent employee to work through rather than a casual because it would be slightly cheaper. Again, you've obviously got to run your operations and that's the way to do it. So, just to answer that question before, if somebody doesn't want to take a meal break, they've got, there's certain rules about when they do need to take it, but you can absolutely pay them to work through it. It's just that it will trigger some penalty rates, and it's, up to you to work out whether that's something that you want to be paying. Do we have any questions?
We don't have a question per se, more of a comment, which I, appreciate the difficulties, but I guess Daniel has mentioned that he thinks that analysis is great, but the expectation on business is to be able to do that for multiple employees over a fortnight and do this sort of analysis. The burden on administering this is quite high.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree, and it's a tough system that we have to work with to make sure you get it right from a compliance. And then B, how are you doing that in the most efficient way that's cost effective for your business? It is burdensome. I mean, we do offer a service, a payroll audit that can help you put together some, check whether you are compliant and then help put together some rosters, which we'll talk about in the end. But maybe that's something you want to take a look at if you're finding it pretty difficult at the moment. But
and I guess we do have members with, pretty sophisticated payroll systems that you can set rules up during vintage that are quite good. But again, we would always recommend you do need to continually reassess and assess that the rules are applying correctly. So you would want to do an audit to make sure the rules are applying correctly. But once you've got a pretty good base set up, that can be assist in managing that burden, but that's certainly something that we can sort of review to make sure they are applying correctly.
The other real option to kind of get away from some of the minutiae is that you do pay an above award rate that you calculate, will take into account all of these possible provisions. I know we had a question earlier then the session, somebody shot one through yesterday, so thank you, which is, you know, they pay, I believe it was 150% to casuals on the permanent rate as a base for the first 50 hours, you know, and then they were sort of questioning whether that was okay to do. What our advice is, if you're paying things like that, like absolutely, you can pay above award rates, that's no problem. But you just have to do the math. Like, it's very hard to sort of, I think the question was also around, oh, and is that okay then if they work through the meal break? You can see that there's so many sort of different factors about when did they start, how long did they work through it, when was the meal break due, and then how long did they work after it. Is that like the theoretically, yes, you can absolutely pay 1.5 on the base, and that should cover a number of things, but you definitely have to do the maths of the exactly when they start, when they're working through, was there overtime, just to really make sure you do have that covered. Once that upfront work is done and you've kind of set yourselves up, you know, paying an above board rate can just be an easy catch-all, and then you just need to, you know, maybe do an audit once every now and again to make sure that you're still above it. But I generally find that's where sort of a few people are heading, to get away from the minutiae of the details.
We've also just had a question that they found this example for a day worker very helpful. Do we have an example for someone who's paid as a shift worker?
I don't have one in this slide deck as a shift worker, but if there is some value in it, I could put that together and we could send it out after. I'd just ask for a little bit of time to to get the graphics. It did take a little while, but we can definitely do one if you think that's helpful.
Yeah,
to the group
visually, to see it set out like that can be yeah, we've got other requests for that. So yeah, we'll give us a little bit of time, but we'll come up with a weak example of some shift work scenarios as well, because I think that might be clearer, just sort of setting that out as well, especially over the different weekdays. Got another question here. If we are paying our vintage casuals a flat rate above award, which incorporates all overtime and penalties, would we still need to make sure meal breaks are taken on time, or can we build it into the rate?
Yeah, so great. You can build it into the rate. Again, just do the math to make sure it's in there. What we would also say when you are building in an above award payment is that any contract stipulates, has an offset clause. So it basically says you're paid above the award. Therefore, any above award payment that we pay you is covering, and then you set out all the things it's covering. If it's annual leave loading, if it's meal breaks, if it's, you know, whatever it is, be really specific to catch everything. So if you, I don't know, if you didn't say it covered, I don't know, annual leave loading, for example, you can't, it's hard to come back later and go, no, I meant for it to cover annual leave loading. You've got, the courts have now said you have to be really specific in all the areas it covers. So you do the analysis, work out what it all covers, and then you write it in that contract of employment. Again, members, if you've got, you know, contracts and they need to be reviewed, do that. But we've obviously got some templates, but you've got to make sure it fits for your specific employee as well. And we've got everything covered.
And I just say also, just to protect yourselves, conduct reconciliations every now and then to make sure, based practically how things are working, whether that rate is enough to cover it. Like in particular, if they don't end up taking their meal break at all, the penalty applies until it's taken. So if it's not taken at all, that penalty is applying that whole day. So you just got to make sure, practically speaking, if they're only delaying their meal break by an hour or two, then that, you know, that's, you might calculate that into it. But if they're not taking it at all, and then they're getting a requirement for, you know, overtime, meal break, like just make sure, practically speaking, that you make sure that rate's covered.
The other thing I know, I think I just saw a question earlier, was where if you do have a above award rate, so you're paying above award, and for some reason you do then end up paying for overtime or a penalty rate, what rate do you calculate that overtime or penalty rate on? So the answer to that's going to depend on your contract. So if you pay above an award rate, above which incorporates everything, you only need to meet the minimum requirements of the award. So if you wanted to pay penalty rates because, you know, you're worried that your buffer was getting low, you only would need to do that on the minimum rate in the award. So you don't have to, if you have an above award rate and then you want to pay a penalty rate, you don't have to do it on the whatever that new rate of pay is, that high rate of pay. You can do it on the base rate of pay that is in the award, provided that your contract expresses that, you know, you can't change that unilaterally midway through. But it doesn't have to be, you know, you don't have to pay overtime or a penalty rate on your new all-inclusive rate. You just need to make sure you're meeting the total minimums of the award, so you can do it on that award rate. Does that? I feel like does that make sense, Annalise? Do you want to add to that? No?
Yeah, no, I think it makes sense. I think what Louise essentially is saying is that the Fair Work Ombudsman, if we look at Fair Work Ombudsman, they can only enforce legal minima. So they can only enforce what's in the award. So if the award says that if you work overtime, you should be getting $30. If you're paying, you know, above, then they can't apply award, you know, penalty rates on a higher loaded rate. But if you have in your contract agreed to do that, then you're bound by the contract. So it becomes a contractual issue. But you are, you know, if you don't address it, then, you know, the ombudsman is unlikely to get involved and have views on that you should paying, you know, penalty rates on a higher loaded rate, because they can only enforce and that, you know, that you get your award minima. I think that's essentially.
Thank you, Henry. That was, I feel much more succinct. The only thing I'll just add to this slide is I've taken an assumption that the 10-minute rest break is taken. I haven't put in an actual line item for it, but just to remind you that there's a 10-minute paid break per day.
Right. I've got one more question, which I'm happy to take. So the question is, just to clarify meal breaks, if we roster an employee an 11-hour shift, say 5 a.m. to 4 p.m., would they would take the meal break after 5 hours, or 4.5 for a shift worker? Do they work the rest of the shift without another meal break? They do not need to take the break after 5 hours, then again after the next 5 hours. So like I said, it's not every 5 hours, it's just that first meal break. The real key of the question here is whether an overtime meal break applies. So if you're calculating your employees' work hours as overtime kicks in after, say, 8 hours, then as they've worked more than 3 hours of overtime, they'd need that overtime meal break of paid meal break of half an hour. But if your rostering works that they can work up to 10 hours as ordinary hours, then they just get that one meal break and that's it. Anything to add there?
No, I think that's spot on, yeah.
Clarifies that. All right. Okay, I think
we'll move to the next section. I'll just hand over to Annalise.
All right. Now we're just going to go over a little bit over time off in lieu of overtime, which is a provision under the award which you might consider for your staff, or you might already be doing. So essentially it's an agreement with the business and the employee to elect to take time off instead of being paid for overtime. So it needs to be agreed in advance in writing. And essentially it's like an hour of paid toil for an hour of overtime work. So you get an hour off for an hour of overtime work that's been baked up. Now, what's a little bit tricky in the award is that technically it requires a separate agreement each pay period where overtime is worked that it is to be taken as time off. So technically you need to set out a new agreement every pay period that an employee wishes to take toil instead of being paid that overtime. The agreement needs to set out the date and time of overtime worked and, you know, the portion they want to be taken as time off. Now, we appreciate that's not very practical, especially if toil is commonplace. We suggest if you want to avoid breaching the award, potentially you might want to set up an individual flexibility arrangement with your employee in order just to have a once-off agreement rather than having to sign a separate agreement each pay period. Other requirements under the award is that it needs to be taken within 6 months. If it's not taken, then you have to just pay that out. But it needs to be paid out at the overtime rate. And also at any time, the employee can request that instead of taking the time off, that they'd rather get their overtime paid out, then you have to pay it out at the overtime rate. Also, it needs to be paid out at whatever their current rate is. So if they banked some toil hours, say 4 months ago, and since then they've had a raise, just like annual leave, like you bank your annual leave, you're paid out at the time, at the current rate at the time. So just something to look out for there as well in managing toil. But yeah, feel free to shoot through any questions or talk to us after if you want assistance around arranging that. You know, some businesses like to have a toil policy. You just don't want to get in a situation where employees start working all this extra hours and then they suddenly say, oh, well, that's toil and I request time off. You know, it needs to be very specific written agreement agreed ahead of time. An employee can't just after the fact say, oh, I've worked all this extra time, I should get time off. It needs to be planned ahead. Particularly we see businesses, we've got winemakers where they might be award free, but you've got winemakers during vintage that are working, you know, way longer hours than usual because of vintage. You might want to have sort of something written up in your contract or a policy around how you want to arrange that, but it can't be just something that an employee after the fact says, oh, you know, I want time off because of all this overtime I've worked. Right. Now, I'll just briefly touch on this one. It doesn't come up too much, but there is a callback provision in the award. So it's where an employee is recalled to work overtime after leaving the business premises. This typically might be like bringing an employee back in because of machinery breakdown in the middle of the night, or shift worker sick, or a common one is like frost alert. But yeah, typically might be like a day worker that's called back to work in the middle of the night. The key points here are they must be paid a minimum engagement of 4 hours at overtime rates, unless it's customary to return to work to perform specific tasks outside their ordinary working hours. Now, this is a bit of an interesting one. There is no definition of what's customary, and this hasn't really been tested before, so we can't give a definitive answer on it. You know, it could be what's the business custom or industry custom, or even it could be what the regional custom is. There could be an argument that, say, an employee in their contract, they know as part of their role, they're required to do frost alerts. So it's kind of a customary part of their role to be on call for that. It's in that specific period. Like I said, it's not been tested, so we can't definitively say whether that would fall under this definition in the award. But look, practically speaking, if you're asking an employee to come back in the middle of the night to do overtime work, but you only want them to work for an hour, probably most employees wouldn't agree to this. So I'd say best practice would be just to pay for the minimum engagement of 4 hours. And the other exception is if the overtime is immediately after they've finished their work or before their shift, so they haven't actually gone home. So that's where you don't have to do that minimum 4 hours. But yeah, feel free to question on this if you'd like.
Annalise, before we get into flexibility, we did have a question which relates to ordinary hours, and that is,
yeah.
There is capacity to extend ordinary hours to 12. The question was, if we are making an agreement, can we do this with just our permanent employees, and then it applies to casual vintage crew that come on board? Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so the award allows you to extend ordinary hours to 12. And all it says is that you can do that where there's an agreement between the employer and the majority of employees in the relevant workplace or sections of it. So it doesn't require the way sort of it's been applied is that you can have an agreement at that point in time, which then applies going forward. It's not an agreement that you have to, do every year, or you have to consult every new employee. You basically make an agreement at that time with the majority of the staff that this is the way you're going to apply ordinary hours, and that will continue to operate.
Yeah, I agree there, Henrik. Yeah,
I agree too. All right. On that note, in a similar tone, so there are flexibility options in the award. So I'll just go through a few key ones. So under clause 7, we have facilitative provisions, essentially they allow departure from some award provisions with agreement, some by majority, so it has to be majority of employees, and some are individual agreements. So that could be changing the maximum daily ordinary hours or the spread of hours, but an individual agreement might be an agreement to cash out annual leave. So it just, that clause lists a big table of basically the different provisions in the award that can be departed from by agreement. Clause 17 talks about piecework rates, which allows an employee to earn a piece rate rather than hourly rate. I'll go into that more detail on that shortly. And the other one that we've talked about a fair bit today is individual flexibility arrangements. You can find the details on that in clause 5 of the award. Essentially, it's an agreement with an individual employee to vary the award if permitted in permitted sections, which essentially it has to leave the employee better off overall than if the award applied. So there are some restrictions on that they need to be better off overall, and it only relates to some sections of the award. So you can only vary it in relation to arrangements for when work is performed, overtime rates, penalty rates, allowances, or annual leave loading. So those are the sections where you can have an IFA apply to these specific sections. Right, moving on, just briefly, I'll just quickly talk about piecework arrangements. Look, might not have many businesses do that, but there are still a few that do engage in piecework. But look, essentially the most common example would be pruning, so where the worker would get paid per vine pruned. So it allows payment of a piecework rate instead of paying them a minimum hourly rate. So under a piecework arrangement, the employee can work any time of the day, any day of the week. And basically these rules of the award don't apply. So no minimum wage guarantee, ordinary hours don't apply, penalties, they don't get overtime. So you could have a worker that can be hired to do a mix of piecework and like just regular hourly rate shifts. The key is that it has to be documented. You have to have a piecework arrangement written up, setting out the piecework rate. So the rate must enable an employee of average capacity to earn at least 20% more per hour than the minimum hourly rate for ordinary hours of work at that classification level. So yeah, it's an interesting one. It can be a positive as like a bonus to workers. So you could have your vineyard workers, they could do their 38 hours, but they could also do piecework rate and earn a bit of extra cash as a bonus, but that doesn't go towards the 38 hours. So it can be used as a bit of a bonus. But look, if you've got any specific questions, feel free to contact us afterwards and we can help you in terms of how do you develop a piecework rate or how do you determine what the rate is. Yeah, feel free to talk about that. All right, now we'll move on to some practical considerations, like just overall, when we're talking about all these factors, what should we consider?
Before we start, Annalise, Henrik, do we have more questions? Do you want to?
Yes, we do have so we had one question, that is, how could you vary ordinary hours, so extending it from 10 to 12 per day, essentially nullifying the overtime rates that would otherwise apply? How would that leave sort of employees better off? So the question, so the answer is that yes, you're entitled to do it with the majority of staff. It means that, you know, on particular days, then you can work up to 12 ordinary hours per day, obviously, without overtime rates. What would happen is that you would use up the 38 a lot quicker. So if you have 12 hour days applying, well, after essentially 3 days, you know, those ordinary hours are gone and the rest of the week will be overtime essentially. So there's no sort of better off overall test which applies to that. It is an agreement with staff which you're entitled to do. Louise, would you want to add anything to that? Yeah,
I think it just comes back to like, it's got to be by agreement with the employee. So it becomes sort of, not that there's a better off overall test, as Henrik said, but if they weren't happy to do it, then they wouldn't agree to it. So it might be, I'm just trying to think of a particular operation that might work best on 12-hour days for what would you'd hit, your 38 hours, as Henrik said, pretty much within three days. if that seemed to work better operationally, then you could look at it.
And some workers, like they might want to work in condensed working week rather than over long periods.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just want to clarify, which I think Henrik and Louise both have, but the better off overall test is only when it comes to the individual, like it only mentions that in regard to the individual flexibility arrangement, which is between the employer and employee, whereas this provision makes no mention of it needing to be better off overall. It just has to be by agreement. So as long as the staff agree to it and they think that, obviously employees aren't going to agree to it unless they think there's a benefit to them. But if overall as a business and employees agree to it, it doesn't have to fit any sort of test of they need to be better off under the award because of it.
So Henrik, are you just having it? I think somebody's giving us an example of when they have been able to use it successfully.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, exactly. So a member gave an example that they did this during COVID to ensure business continuity. So they ran 2 separate teams on a 3-day roster within the winery, so doing 12 hours, and that was agreed to by the staff. Louise, there was also a question on whether we have employment contracts templates that we can provide on a fee-for-service basis to businesses, whether they are members or non-members.
Yes, we do. So we have a suite of employment agreements: casual, permanent,
Award-free,
part-time, award-free, award covered. We do cover it all. So if that is something you're interested in, please do drop me a line and let me know what you're after. Sorry, just reading one more. I believe a WA example, if I'm right. They said they actually do it as well, that the 12-hour, potentially the 12-hour days, and workers agree to it because they drive in and drive out from other towns, so they prefer to do that 3 days, get it done, and then leave. So that's probably a great reason to do that as well. But obviously, if it fits you operationally, and sometimes it will, and sometimes it won't.
all right.
Practical consideration. So, look, we've spent most of the time really on the wages and the wine industry award. Just a couple of quick areas just to consider practically during vintage and what other things you should consider. I guess it's not during vintage, but anytime you're employing a staff member. So I'll just quickly go through them. Is that for 2025, we've got the 2 additional public holidays in South Australia that weren't traditionally covered, Christmas and Easter. And then the other key thing to note with the public holidays is if you want staff to work during the public holidays, we have a number of them during vintage, during Easter and Anzac Day, and potentially Australia Day. Is that there has been a relatively recent case that confirmed that you can request an employee to work a public holiday, but you cannot require them to work a public holiday. So they do have the right to say no on reasonable grounds. So you may have to work individually through that. Particularly for members, if you've got a particular scenario, you can give us a buzz and we can work through that with you.
Might be just on that, Louise, it might be worth in your sort of induction early on, just flag that if you are working during vintage, there are a number of public holidays, and there may well be a need for those hours to be worked to get the vintage done, given that we have a limited period of time. But as you say, Louise, it is done on an individual level whether that request is reasonable or not. So an employee can't just simply refuse. They have to have grounds for it, which could be family responsibilities, nature of the workplace, notice, of course. So the more notice you can give, the more likely it is to be reasonable.
Great, thank you, Henrik. The next point is just we are coming up to Christmas shutdown, or some of you will shut down. There has been another recent change that you cannot require an employee to take unpaid leave. So they have the right to say no, and then you would either need to pay them for annual leave or to pay them to work during that period. So it's just about getting your ducks in a row early, you know, and making sure that you're working out what your Christmas plans are. Are you declining leave now because you want people to take it over Christmas? So just really preparing for if you do shut down, and typically have in the past required people to take unpaid leave. The next point with the practical considerations is really just a reminder of whether you're employing or outsourcing and what your responsibilities are. So there's, you know, quite a big focus in the closing loopholes legislation that's come in over the past couple of years, just to remind you about sham contracting. So, you know, the summary that I like to give is if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And that kind of comes back to the employment situation. So, you know, if you do have contractors and they've come to you and said, I've got an ABN, but actually in practical reality they're not, then you may want to take a look at that. So it's about the real substance and the practical reality of that working relationship, not that they've just got an ABN in front of them. So have a, you know, check on that if that's something that you need to do. The next one is just migration and the right to work. So just to consider a couple of things, often we get a lot of migrant workers during this period. Do you have the right process in place to check their working rights? There can be penalties imposed to the individual and the business. The requirement is that you have a reasonable process. So that could be you're asking for a birth certificate, a passport, you check on Vivo, and those obligations do extend to contractors on your work site, that there's a reasonable requirement that you've made an arrangements to check, or you've had that in place with the contractor, that you know that there's a process to ensure that they're legally allowed to work here. And just a last note on the working holiday maker. Really, this is just a reminder, I guess, about the tax situation. So in the last few years, I think it was 2021, there was a case that changed the tax withholding rate for working holiday visas who came from a country. They had an agreement called NDA. It's a non-discriminatory, non-discriminatory, I've now forgotten the acronym, non-discriminatory association, or anyone got it? Sorry, I'll come back and find what the acronym was. Essentially, there's a few countries where you can apply them working as a resident, the Australian resident for tax purposes, because they're from a country that does hold the NDA with Australia. So Chile, Finland, Germany, Japan, Norway, Turkey, United Kingdom, and Israel. So they are the ones that you can apply that to. But as always, do check with your accountant for any specific tax advice. Non-discriminatory article, sorry, I've got the A. Non-discriminatory article, that's what it's called. Just a quick example on that refusing to work a public holiday. It is one that does tend to come up around Easter, so just to get in front of it. This one is about Henrik, who's a grade 2 cellar hand. He's employed over vintage in a winery in South Australia. He's got some past experience working in the cellar and is being told his employment will continue once the vintage season's over. He's rostered to work the Monday, the 11th of March, which is Adelaide Cup Day, at public holiday rates, but his family's already booked a holiday house together for that long weekend. He lets his manager know that he's not coming in on Monday, and the business clarifies that he's required to come in and work the public holiday because of the vintage. So what do we do in this situation? As I said before, it must be a request, not a requirement. So the section 114 of the Fair Work Act clarifies that a request to work on a public holiday needs to be, and the refusal needs to be reasonable, and a request from an employer will be reasonable when the employee can reasonably expect that an employer might request work on the public holiday. So back to Henrik's earlier points, is giving, you know, advance notice, making sure it's really clear, will kind of lead into that reasonability. All right, we're just going to do a quick, we're going to do the case study, just checking how we are for time. Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to run through that one?
Yeah, look, I'll quickly rush through it in the interest of time. This is just an example for labour hire workers. So Adrian's a small quantity winemaker who needs some help with the vintage and vineyards. He approaches a local labour hire provider who says they can send workers to handpick his grapes. They offer grade 2 vineyard hands at the grade 2 casual rate under the award of $30.95. Adrian's happy this will solve his workforce problem and breathes a sigh of relief that they're charging the award rate for the work. But consider, is it too good to be true? Because if the labour hire is charging the exact rate of the award rate, you might want to question, well, is that rate actually being passed on to these workers? Because when you think about it practically, it would be untenable for conducting a labour hire business. They have to pay minimum award rates to their workers, as well as loadings, entitlements, return to work insurance, superannuation guarantee for all employees, and operating costs. So if they're only charging charging you at the rate of the grade 2 rate, then you might question, or I think they might not be paying their staff properly, so you might want to reconsider engaging this contractor. So just something to watch out for when engaging contractors, to make sure that they're meeting their entitlements. All right, now moving on. I think this was you covering this one.
Keep doing it in and out, sorry.
No.
All right, so just some other pre-employment considerations. In particular, the Fair Work Information Statement that needs to be provided to employees. Particularly related to vintage will be the Casual Fair Work Information Statement. Recently, we've had an update to that Casual Fair Work Information Statement. So if you are providing it, please ensure you have the up-to-date one. As of last night, the new date on the bottom of it was August 2024. So make sure yours says that. There's also some new rules on the frequency of providing it to your employees. So it is as soon as practically after you employ them, as well as I think for casuals it's every 6 months. So it might not impact you if you've only got casuals that stay less than 6 months, but just to I advise familiarising yourself with that frequency rate. It is a lot more than it has been previously. The second thing just to remember with your pre-employment consideration is, do you have an employment contract or a letter of offer? Particularly for your vintage casuals, it can be really easy not to have a full-on contract, but do have a letter of offer that it's talking about their award, their classification, potentially their rate. Do you need to have an offset clause in it, in the sense of if you are paying above award, offsetting any above award payments against the things it's offsetting, annual leave loading, overtime, penalties, whatever it is, make sure it's, robust. Just to, look back for the casuals as well, just to make sure that if it is a vintage casual, you do want to be saying that it is for the period of vintage. While we've had the closing loopholes and the casual conversion has the change in the casual nature has, I think, helped to sort of say you're a casual unless you ask to be permanent. The onus is now on the employee rather than the employer. It's still a good idea in any sort of letter of offer, just to be really clear that this is for the period of vintage. There's no firm advance commitment of work post vintage. The last thing to think about is also, do you have a toil policy? If you do, as Annalise sort of went through this before, does it work for you? We've definitely had a bit of an uptick in a few businesses coming back saying we have a toil policy, but we don't like it, it's not working, they want to have a change. So it's a good practice to maybe have a look at before you get into the full throes of vintage. I mentioned the over award payments and, up here in the offset clause. But, the key thing is, do your contracts make it clear when there are above award payments? And also, if so, and you are paying penalties at all, what is the penalty rate on? Is it on that all-inclusive rate, or is it on that base, the award rate of pay? Last thing, just a reminder that we have an online safety induction video. It's a great 30-minute video. It is free. It is on our website. It is a really great introduction for people like vintage casuals that are coming into a new area, a new business. It goes through the whole gambit of the life cycle of the wine industry. If you haven't looked at it already, highly recommend. We can send that out in the link. It is a really easy one to send to your employees to watch, and it covers a lot. So highly recommend that video.
Just have a question.
Oh, yeah.
One was on what was the frequency of providing the Fair Work Statement. I'll just cover that one. Just to clarify, so when you're hiring your staff, you have to provide the Fair Work Information Statement. That's for everyone when they start a job. If you're employing casuals, you also have to provide them with the Casual Employment Information Statement. So all businesses have to do that. If you're a small business employer, so less than 15 employees, you only have to then re-provide them the Casual Employment Information Statement after 12 months. And that's it. So when you hire them and after 12 months, whereas for a larger business, you have to provide it when they start, after 6 months, after 12 months, and then every 12 months thereafter, you have to keep providing that Casual Employment Information Statement. That's basically more just like a refresher to make sure that they know what their rights are, because now it's an employee-led process, so they can request conversion. It's not the business has to offer it anymore. So yeah, it's a slight more administrative burden, but I guess the onus is no longer on the business to offer that conversion. So yeah, just maybe, set up in your payroll system or whatever systems you have, just setting reminders to make sure that you send that information statement out as a reminder. Now, I think we also have one more question, which I haven't looked at yet. Can I please double check something that was said early on? Grades 1 and 2, which is time-based, i.e. up to 12 months, grade 1, 24 months, grade 2. With overseas experience on resume, does this count even though employer has no idea yet about their abilities?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think this is one of the ones where it's not black and white, and that what you need to be able to do if the employee made a complaint and the inspector came in is said, I've done my reasonable due diligence to assess them and therefore I'm putting them here. So potentially if they can't provide any evidence, or you can't find the winery on a website or something, or they can't tell you what they did, you might want to, you can say, well, I've done all this and it's a level 1. I don't know, like if they came from a treasury or something overseas and it could be quite simple, you might be erring towards a level 2. So I know that's not a definitive answer and that's really hard. What it really needs to be is what my view is that if you're sitting in front of an inspector and they've been called and they're saying, why did you put them as a level 1? You've got something that is a due diligence process to suggest why they should be at a 1 or a 2. Henrik, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good explanation, Louise. I would also say that level 1 is an introductory rate, so it is basically someone who's not experienced, and you are required to provide sort of on-the-job training and induction. So if you're employing someone but you expect them to work independently with basically no supervision, then you couldn't slot them into number 1, because number 1 is basically someone kind of off the street hand-holding, and you spend time to upskill them and give them the skills to do the work sort of independently. So you kind of have to pick, I suppose, where they fit. But also there's nothing in the award which says that like overseas experience doesn't count, because we wouldn't be able to do that. That would be discriminatory. So it's really about doing your best effort to determine their skills and experience, and maybe you have to start them at 1 to kind of assess them. But if it's clear that they don't need that sort of close supervision and close guidance and management, then 2 would probably be the appropriate one.
Any more questions on that, Annalise?
Yes. So from Rachel, she's asked if somebody has spent 4 years doing a traineeship, can they be a level 2? And she's also before that said, does time spent doing a traineeship, although not covered by the winery award, get included in the time level for grade 1 and grade 2? So I guess traineeships, whether they contribute towards determining that grade level. Do you want to take that, Henry?
I would say that traineeships is it's almost a world on its own. So very happy to look into that and look at that sort of separately. I would say if you've done a traineeship not under wine, then you wouldn't have experienced in wine and it wouldn't count. If you've done a wine industry operations cert 2 and 3, which is a traineeship, I think we just have to look at what the start point would be. once you finished it. So so please get in touch, or we can get in touch with you post the session to discuss that in more detail.
We've also had someone say, obviously, reference checks should confirm their experience and competency, and I think that's a key point. In part of that interview process, you should be able to get a judge. If you start talking about technical things and they're going, oh, I don't know what you're talking about, then you can kind of get a gauge of experience level just through that interview process as well. It should be, informed. I did have a quick question as to whether the Fair Work Information Statement has to be provided a hard copy, whether it can be emailed, and that's fine. It can be emailed, send a link or whatever. It doesn't have to be a hard copy. Henrik, I've got a question. Does WSET classify as qualifications? I'm gonna see if you know.
Yeah, so WSET, we said wine and spirits education trust qualification, international recognized in its different levels. So it can be on a sommelier level. So the award doesn't refer to classification specifically, but if you got someone who's got WSET qualification, you probably would expect them to be fairly senior, working in the cellar door. But once again, it comes down to what you require of them. Like, what are the skills that they're bringing, all the skills that you're requiring. So the fact that someone has a qualification, if you don't require them to utilize the qualification, then you have to look at what they employed to do. But if someone brings with a qualification, maybe that's something that you want to utilize. But once again, it comes down to the task you're performing. There is in grade 3, it talks about a wine appreciation external course. So I mean, that would be an example of it, but you have to look into like the broader work that they perform. I hope that sort of clarifies it.
All right. Do we have more questions?
That's good
for now?
Yeah.
Great. All right. Henrik, do you want to take us through the during employment considerations?
Yes.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Had a couple of questions. We will be emailing out these slides just so people don't have to frantically write notes. We will be sending out a copy of these notes after the session. Thanks. Sorry, Henrik.
Yes. So just very briefly, in terms of during employment considerations, what we wanted to highlight, which is not sort of award conditions, is that, as you might be aware, last year in December, we had something called the positive duty to prevent sexual harassment came in through amendments to the Sex Discrimination Act. What that means is that there is a requirement and expectation on businesses to proactively take steps to prevent workplace sexual harassment and hostile work environment on the basis of sex. So we basically have to apply the same principles as we are doing in safety. We have to do risk assessments, we have to implement policies, we have to implement training, and it is a requirement of the business to not sort of wait until something goes wrong, but proactively manage the risk of workplace sexual harassment. So just wanted to highlight that's something that you may want to, that you should consider if you haven't already, particularly during vintage, because you may get younger workers, inexperienced workers, people who generally are perceived to be more vulnerable, and also depending on, I guess, your location, you may have people sort of living on site in dorms, for example. So that's just sort of a heightened risk. So in terms of training, that is something that we can provide. We can do it as a webinar. Obviously, we can do it on site, depending on where you're located. So just wanted to highlight that. Related to sexual harassment, but separate, is the psychosocial hazards. So we have had changes to the Work Health and Safety Act in numerous states and also federally. That there is a requirement, and there's always been a requirement, but it's been clarifications added that safety also includes psychosocial safety. So it's not just sort of keeping workers physically safe from injuries, but also ensuring that the work environment doesn't cause psychosocial harms, which could be obviously depression, anxiety, and so on and so forth. And in order to assist businesses, the health and safety authorities have issued a code of practice. So they work through basically what is psychosocial hazards, and that could include things like fatigue, workplace stress, having too much work, having not enough work, having, I guess, role ambiguity, not knowing what you're responsible for, unclear reporting lines. It could be, a lot of workplace conflicts. It could be harassment. It could be bullying. It could be, working in isolation. So it's basically a combination of, I guess, safety and HR practices. So what we're saying is that there is an expectation that businesses, when undertaking risk assessments of, plant and equipment, that we don't overlook the psychosocial environment. That is equally important to keep workers safe. So once again, we can provide training if that's something that you're interested in. We can also assist you in working through risk assessments for psychosocial safety. And finally, fatigue is obviously very important during vintage. Workers may be working at night and long hours. So managing fatigue, ensuring that there is some rest periods, and that we do have some breaks that we provide. There's also a code of practice which is now out for consultation. So looking at how do we roster, do we have enough time between shifts that people can rest? And when we talked about sort of meal breaks and the fact that, under the award, if we don't have a meal break, we get a penalty that we pay. I mean, that's fine. You can have people working through meal breaks, but it doesn't negate the risk that poses in terms of safety. That we still, from a safety perspective, look at, do we give enough sort of time for rest and breaks for workers?
Thanks, Henrik. I've got a question, probably a little bit more on our topic from earlier, from Izzy. Coming back to juniors working in the kitchen, if their tasks do not change over 12 months, are we required to increase their pay level? I guess it depends whether we're talking about they're employed under the Restaurant Industry Award versus the Wine Industry Award.
Yeah. If it's a
So-
restaurant, I think we'd have
Yeah,
to.
so go on, Grace.
Oh, no, I was going to say, I'd have to look up the restaurant award off the top of my.
Well, Restaurant Award doesn't have any sort of time-based requirement from grade 1 to grade 2, does it?
Yes, that's my understanding. So really, in terms of we have to look at the restaurant award, because the junior percentages are likely to be different. But
Yeah,
generally, in terms of your age, so the junior rates will increase the percentage, but that doesn't necessarily flow on to a higher classification, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So the classifications don't tend to be age bound. The rates are age bound, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Might need more clarification.
Yeah, what we might do is come back specifically on that one. Just make sure we capture it.
I'll just quickly cover from Melissa. Are there rules around engaging a person on an ABN during harvest? To be specific, they will be driving a harvester. I would just sort of point out that there are rules around sham contracting. So essentially, you can't employ someone as a contractor who has an ABN if essentially, for all intents and purposes, they are an employee. So you'll look at can they work for someone else? Like, do they kind of have their own business? Are they able to perform work for other businesses? Are they able to subcontract out their work? Are they required to wear your staff uniform? Are they responsible for supplying their own tools and maintaining their own tools? Are you paying them for hours worked, or are you paying them for a specific job? Depending on these factors, if they're looking more like they don't have much control over the situation, they're coming on site for you, they're paid per hour, you supply everything, then they might appear a bit more like a casual employee, versus if they're a contractor, they bear any sort of financial risk if the job goes wrong. They've got their own insurance, they can delegate the work out. Then they're more likely to be a contractor. So I guess it's just being careful in terms of with the new closing loopholes legislation, the courts will look at the whole of the relationship. So just having a contract that says you're a contractor doesn't necessarily mean they are. You look at the whole of the relationship. So practically speaking, what the relationship is. Anything to add, or?
No, I think it's spot on, yeah.
All right. move on. We're nearly at the end of it, guys.
Sorry.
Hello. So I just thought we might recap some key takeaways from the things we've been discussing today. So like I've said, we've sort of said this all the way along. A lot of this is about, yes, it's about compliance, but it's also about how can you best plan, make strategic plans for your business to make, cost-effective decisions in your rostering. So I guess we would advise that this involves ensuring your operational staff have been educated on making the best rostering decisions. So for example, your winemaker may not consider cost effectiveness in deciding to call back a worker or to roster a particular person for a longer shift. So if you do value cost effectiveness, you might want to educate staff and having some policies around that. But I guess our main advice is do the maths and, calculate what might work better for your business. So when we talk about shift work versus overtime, you can, basically do the maths to see what's cheaper, decide beforehand based on your hours of operation if a shift work ends up being a better rate or if it's better to be overtime. Another tip is to roster a shorter shift to avoid overtime meal break. Having more staff rather than less staff doing much longer shifts, having more staff doing shorter shifts so you don't have to pay overtime rates. And for example, using a different member of staff that didn't work that day if you're calling them back so that you don't have to engage in the callback rules. I guess we've mentioned this before as well, but with choosing how to apply overtime for cost savings. So like we said, if you've got a worker working 38 hours in the week and they're going to consistently work overtime, then it makes more sense to overtime to apply after 8 hours each day, because for the first 2 hours it's that lower rate, and then after 2 hours it's 200%. So it makes more sense to have that applied daily. Whereas if you've got casual workers and most of them aren't likely to go more than 38 hours, you're better off rostering so that having the system that their overtime applies after up to 10 hours so that you're not paying overtime daily when they might not even reach 38 hours at the end of the week. So again, you just got to do that maths, but you do have to be consistent. So you can't change week to week. You can't say for a casual, this week overtime's after 8 hours, next week's overtime after 10 hours. You kind of have to apply it consistently. But like what we said, you could do for the vintage group, it's one run rule, and your permanent staff maybe another. Just needs to be sort of consistent. Also, I guess making sure that the award requires your workers to have a 10-hour break between shifts. So just monitoring who's required to stay later and for operational reasons. And as I mentioned before, you could use piecework as bonus work. So some businesses have used it where winery workers could do piecework in the vineyard to avoid overtime. And so it's, an opportunity for them to earn a bit more money and you to get some work done through that. Also, we just sort of put out a few watch outs. As Louise mentioned, if you're offering an above award rate, if you want to calculate the overtime rate on that base rate for better cost savings, you just have to be really clear that that's set out in the contract. Again, I think we've hashed on this a bit, but making sure you've got a good offset clause, or if you are paying above award, you might have an individual IFA to absorb, any requirement to pay certain entitlements. Basically, it's just making sure that you have it clear and in writing, so that an employee can't go back and say, they didn't get their entitlement. Again, ensuring a meal break at 5 hours or 4.5 hours for shift workers to avoid the working through meal break penalty. I think we've covered that a fair bit anyway. Just to note, toil, it's 1 hour off for 1 hour of overtime unless it's paid out. So just beware of that. If they request it to be paid out, it has to be paid out at that overtime rate, and it will be at the wage that applies at the time. All right, I think we've come to the end. I guess we'll just acknowledge that we've got our industry partners, and you can get special rates or deals through our partners. So feel free to contact us if you want to find out more information, like particularly Australia Post and Bunnings Trade. You can get some really good deals. So please let us know if you're interested in that.
Sorry, Annalise, we did have a sort of a final question,
Yeah.
which is what do you think the compliance rate, i.e. to the letter of the law, the One Industry Award across the industry? That's hard to answer, but I think as Louise mentioned, we did meet with officials from the Fair Work Ombudsman about a month ago, and I've met them previously too. And overall, they're not concerned with our industry. We're not on the radar. The amount of inquiries or complaints they get for staff is very low compared to other industries. Doesn't mean that our industry is perfect. We did have a business, another member of us, who recently had action taken against them in relation to refusing to comply with a direction from the ombudsman. I think it might have been in relation to possibly records or annual leave. Annual leave. So overall, would say I think we're doing pretty well. And I think that comes down to appreciating the complexity of awards, particularly if you're dealing with multiple awards. But also, I think we are an industry which is highly regulated. So I think there's probably a greater sort of appreciation for and maybe being a bit more comfortable in dealing with regulations, because obviously we make alcohol. You need to have a license to sell alcohol. So we have, we got sort of that compliance bit. If you want to export, there are export licenses that is required. And also, I guess, as Louise mentioned in introductory remarks, ESG, in other words, being a good corporate citizen is really important. And we're seeing more push from particularly overseas buyers that they want to see your credentials. They want to see that there are, for example, WHS policies. They want to know that we're not being prosecuted for underpayments and so on and so forth. I think all that combined maybe drives a high level of compliance. It's hard to quote any specific percentages, but that's probably how I would summarize it. Louise, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think as well, just the only thing I'll add, Henrik, is that I think that like I know you don't get points for enthusiasm, but I think that we generally have an industry that wants to do the right thing. But I appreciate that it can still be hard to do that given the complexity that generally the industry wants to. I think that if there's areas of non-compliance, it's more mistaken rather than what would you call it? Deliberate. Yes. But again, as someone in the industry and in awards, it's a complex landscape to deal with, and it's tough as a business owner to have multiple hats, including being an expert in the awards. And what I'd probably just say as well is that's we're here we're on our services slide. I'll take this one. Particularly members, we have our member line. You can contact ourselves on our mobiles. You can contact us on the member line. Non-members, we do a fee for service. So if you do have questions, particularly we've popped on our services with our payroll audit service, where we do a review of timesheets and pay slips and make sure that everything's pretty good to go. We did a recent one of a member where they are pretty, spot on when it comes to things, but we did find particularly areas of overpayments, and just maybe some suggestions of doing things a bit differently. So it is something, if you can, I do recommend. Or even the classification and award review we've done with a number of businesses, and we've sat there and actually let's go through this process and build your framework. So do reach out. That is available for members and non-members as well. So please be in touch if you feel that you need some more support.
Contact us here.
Segue. So as Annalise said, we will be sending out the slides. So please, they will be coming. I've got a couple of notes that we'll follow back up with. I'm going to do up a new graphic. I think it was for shift work. That will probably not come out at the same time as the slides, but we will get that out to you. So you can have that. Yeah. And I think there was a couple of individuals that will follow up just on some further questions that we've got in that Q&A list. Henrik, is there anything to add?
No. Just want to say thank you to everyone for participating, for all your questions and interest. I think that's fantastic. And a big thank you for Louise and Annalise for stepping through this I wouldn't say minefield, but you know, it can be a bit of a maze at times. But I think you provide a really good roadmap so people can find a way through the maze and make informed decisions during vintage. And just want to reinforce, we're here to help. You know, members, please give us a call. Non-members, reach out. We're happy to work with you too on a fee-for-service basis. And with that, I just want to wish everyone a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and a very successful and vintage, hopefully with not too much pain.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.